I would love to bring up, it's an honor to share the stage with him. Let's give a very warm, very appreciative Santa Cruz welcome to Mr. Paul Stamets. So I want to get right into it because nobody wants to hear from me and everyone would love to hear from our esteemed guest here in Santa Cruz. So my first question, and really the first question from our crowd here is, you know, who feels a lot of momentum behind this movement right now in your life and in your community? And so why do you think that this sort of inflection point is happening around mushrooms now? And how can we move forward with that momentum while also staying connected to the roots of this culture as we know it and as it has been on the earth for really thousands of years in traditional uses?
Well, that's a very interesting and complex question. And thank you, Dave, and thanks to all of you in this community for supporting the mushroom movement. You know, there's been some extraordinary paradigm-shifting events throughout the course of history. From our primate ancestors first ingesting psilocybin mushrooms, which I do think is a very plausible explanation for the survival and the evolution of Homo sapiens. We go forward to the time of Plato and Aristotle, the writing of the Republic, to the Magna Carta, to the use of magic mushrooms by indigenous cultures that have been recorded and survived the records of history, to the civil rights movement, to the movement where women were able to given the right to vote, from the Civil War, the emancipation of the slaves. I think this is the emancipation of consciousness now. And I think that mycelium has become more than a metaphor. It's a zeitgeist of our time. And I think with our technology and the crises that we face, you know, fully engaged in 6X, with the fragmentation of information, with the fake media, and no longer is there a common set of facts that people are following, I think there is a innate need right now for a commonality in community. And I think that there are some things in life that are just self-apparently true. And I think when you find these truths in nature, it impacts you in a very, very deep level, beyond that words that can articulate. And I think this is the time. This is happening all over the United States and Canada. It's actually ahead in the United States and Canada versus Europe, but Europe is also awakening. And I think this is a representation of a revolution in the freedom of consciousness that ties us back to the intelligence of nature. I think this is an extraordinarily powerful moment in the evolution of human society. And I think it's represented by the massive crowds that are showing up for this movie all over the United States and now in Europe.
Yeah, and I see we've got a lot of families here. And what, you know, you've been a part of this movement for such a long time. How do you feel the energy shifting in terms of going out with this movie, meeting people? How is it different than it might have been 5, 10, 20 years ago?
Oh, Lord. You know, when I first entered in the field of mycology, I was treated like a leper. I would go to conferences and people would not talk to me. I had long hair. I remember the first time I met Gary Linkoff. He was very nervous being seen to be talking to me. And so it was but I had the good fortune of Dr. Michael Bugh from the Evergreen State College. He mentored me with kindness and courage. He never humiliated me. I think that's a really important thing that teachers know, is not to humiliate or shame a student, no matter how, you know, stupid their comments may be. The fact that they're actually interested in the subject, you need to shepherd them along. And so many of the scientists of the recently past generation has been replaced by scientists within my age group, and a lot of them are quote unquote coming out of the closet. And I think a lot of people here also are surprised by how many like-minded individuals. A question I love asking audiences, this is a legal question, you can answer it, you're not getting in trouble. How many people here have not journeyed on magic mushrooms? Look at that. So, there is a hidden community of psilocybin psychonauts, and we are the majority. And moreover, Mark Hayden from MAPS Canada and I put this slide together. What is not up here is about 10 other universities. These are the current universities that are conducting human clinical trials with psilocybin, approved by the FDA. I gave a talk at the Stanford Medical Conference a few weeks ago, and Dr. Pam Crisco is a friend of mine, and she's an MD, and she was in the audience. And when I got up to start talking about psilocybin mushrooms and neurogenesis, there were 3 or 4 doctors right near her, about 800 doctors in the audience, and they started snickering and making stupid jokes. And they kind of looked around, and no one else was snickering and making sly remarks. I put up the slide, and the other researchers, the physicians, had FOMO, like fear of missing out, because they didn't know about all of this, and yet all these universities are conducting this research. This is unprecedented. And the reason why there is so much FDA-approved clinical studies with psilocybin, it is a breakthrough drug. And for those of you who have not journeyed on magic mushrooms, they're very interesting and unique, because after you've had a massive trip, journey, whatever you want to call it, on magic mushrooms, the next day when you see them on the table, you go, no way. I'm not touching those for a long time. They are anti-addictive by their nature. And yet they're so profoundly influential, and as mentioned in the movie, the fact that you remember this experience gives you benefit. Months, years later. So if you saw the 60 Minutes, special on psilocybin, many of the patients they brought out is also to kind of cover their ass, is people say, oh, it's so incredibly intense, I'd never do that again. But, it gives you a thoughtful repose on the reflection of your life. Similar to what, oppositely, say again with PTSD, if you have a PTSD experience and you hear a gunshot, you see something associated with your PTSD event, you're re-traumatized. What's interesting about psilocybin experiences, when you remember these experiences that have been therapeutically beneficial, you re-benefit from them. So it overlays over the PTS, neurological landscape to give you something that's very positive. I think psilocybin increases intelligence, creativity, and when you're more creative, you're happier. When you're happier, you're more creative. When you're depressed, you're not as creative. And when you're not as creative, you're depressed. It's a binary choice in life, folks. And so I think, ultimately, psilocybin mushrooms make nicer people.
I can co-sign that just looking out at this sea of very friendly, warm faces. I've been in front of a lot of crowds, and there's nothing like a mushroom crowd. And that leads into the next question, and I synthesized a few questions that came up a lot, and what is, how do we destigmatize mushrooms, even just dealing with people in our everyday lives, and how do we, so that's the negative feelings that some people have about mushrooms, how do we help change that, and then on the flip side, how do we amplify the message that we are getting from these mushrooms that is a positive one?
Well, I think all of us can become messengers for mycelium and mushrooms. The fungus fair of Santa Cruz here is a great example. Super great group of people that's continuing on tradition over many, many decades. As was mentioned, mycophobia is the fear of fungi. And we tend to fear that which is unknown, but yet so powerful. And the fact these mushrooms come up and disappear so quickly, whereas our viewscape of plants and animals are points of contact over months, years. But as I mentioned, something like mushrooms that can feed you, kill you, heal you, get you high, and yet they come up and they disappear in 4 or 5 days. The body intellect of our society is just not the same. as with plants and animals. So I think as people become more familiar, they can then allay their fears, and it's natural. See, what was not mentioned in the movie, my first experience with mushrooms was when I was pelting my twin brother when I was 5 years old with puffballs, and then explode upon the point of contact. My mother rushed out and said, "Paul, don't throw puffballs at your twin brother. If the spores get into his eyes, he'll be blinded." Now, that's not true, but I didn't know that. But my mom went back in the house and I said, "Thanks, Mom." And I pelted my twin brother as many puffballs as possible. We do both suffer from from bad eyesight, but that's not because of the spores, at least as far as I know. But nevertheless, there's the attraction of the forbidden. Mushrooms were forbidden fruit, and I've always been attracted to that which is powerful and yet forbidden. And now I think the familiarity factor is giving us a lot more consolation and confidence that this is an area to explore, because it's so fundamental to our very existence. You know, we are descendant of fungi. Fungi create the soils, they create the microbiomes. They give rise to the foliage, to the plants and the trees that create the debris fields that feed the mycelium. They are deterministic in the evolution of habitats, and they are edge runners. Many of these saprophytes are. They're at the interface environments of change, and they're the leading edge of change. And epigenetically, which basically means that genomic expressions can be elicited in response to external environmental stimuli. And epigenetically, the network design of the mycelium is perfectly suited to adapt rapidly to change, to code for new proteins that can break down toxins. And we have a lot of toxic threats in our ecosystem, and so these fungi are all these interface environments. The last thing I just want to mention on this is that the psilocybin mushrooms typically follow human activity. Very rarely, and the reason why psilocybin mushrooms were so surprising to the mycologists, professional mycologists all over North America, is they didn't see them. In the cow pastures, yes, with Psilocybe cubensis, but the wood decomposing psilocybes, rarely ever seen until beauty bark and wood chips. And then suddenly they were prolific, and these mycologists were caught unawares. They had no experience with these until the advent of beauty bark and wood chips. And so the psilocybin mushrooms seem to chase us and follow us in association with our creating debris fields and catastrophes. And since we're the greatest walking catastrophe I know on the planet, the mushrooms, the psilocybin mushrooms, are rushing after us to hopefully give us, wisdom to be able to correct our ways.
Absolutely. Who feels that? On the micro and the macro, I think. Listening to what you said, Paul, it reminds me of that quote: first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, the snickering, then they fight you, and then you win. And we're gonna win. And one of the things that I think we're looking to win is this decriminalization campaign that's happening here in Santa Cruz, that's happening statewide. There's information out in the hallway about how to get involved. And my question to you is, when trying to make that case, that simple case, we should not be arresting people for having a plant, what are the best arguments? I'm sure you've had this conversation with a variety of audiences. How do you boil it down to the elevator pitch of that?
What right do we have to outlaw a species? I mean, think of that. The hubris of humans to think that we have the right to outlaw a species or your possession of a species. I think the decriminalized nature movement is so important on so many different levels. But moreover, it's the reinvestment in biodiversity and the complexity of nature. And since we mentioned nature, I published, I'm the lead author of an article on saving bees from colony collapse. And we published in Nature, the journal, and our article still to this day, after about a month or two, is in the top 1% of all articles ever published in a Nature publication ecosystem. Now, Nature is the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. Only 7% of the articles submitted get approved. And why this article is so extraordinary is we're using natural extracts of polypore mushrooms, reishi mushrooms, the mycelium grown on sawdust, and we're able to show a reduction of viruses, in one case, 45,000 to 1, of the viruses that harm bees with one treatment of an extract, 1 drop per 100 drops of sugar water fed to commercial beekeepers, and we're able to make the case that a natural product offers a greater bioshield of benefits than a pure pharmaceutical, for which there are no pharmaceuticals for reducing viruses in bees. I think this underscores that our receptor sites in our immune system are complex, and we benefit from the complexity of nature, and our ancestors went through tens of thousands of species of mushrooms to be able to cull down to about 30 or 40 or 50 that interface with our human and animal health in a way that empowers our immune system. This is a keystone discovery because we can elaborate the very same extracts to reduce viruses in bees, reduce viruses in pigs, swine, and birds, and in humans. So I think I found something that is a paradigm discovery and understanding that we are in constant biomolecular communication with the ecosystem that surrounds us, and as our immunity is challenged, as we lose biodiversity, we lose our immunological foundation that keeps us healthy. As we lose trees, as we destroy habitats, we're unraveling the very fabric of nature that's given us birth. And I think it is our time now to understand how to use these complex mixtures, natural products, in a way that can fortify immunity to offer you an armamentarium of defenses against multiple vectors of pathogens and stressors. That's how fundamental I think this discovery is. And so my response to people who want to outlaw, natural products or the possession, for instance, of psilocybin is, in a very realistic way, you're shooting yourself in the foot. By suppressing this information, you're harming the community at large.
Absolutely. I think just looking behind us, we see in this how the medical community is starting to have a paradigm shift and come to reality and understand the science. Do you see a similar shift happening in the environmental community in that these ideas are being looked at for all the potential that they have, or is it still pushing up against that, being ignored and being pushed out of the conversation?
No, I mean, the scientific method likes to unravel variables. The complexity of nature offers so many variables, it's very hard to determine the cause and effect. And so with microremediation and microfiltration, we have really good demonstrations that it works. Sheet mulches, for instance, infused with mycelium in swales that lead to sensitive downstream environments. Stormwater runoff. We published a paper in the Journal of Ecological Engineering showing we could reduce E. coli substantially. So the complex systems are really hard to discern all the variables that are at play. And so there is also tremendous inertia against novel technologies. These are disruptive technologies. I spent 20 years trying to get microremediation using fungi to break down toxic waste and bring it to market. And I faced enormous hurdles, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of my own money, and I just basically gave up. Well, I didn't quite give up. I created blocking patents, which I then abandoned, put them into the commons, so nobody could patent this information. I'm hoping that the younger generation will pick these things up as a grassroots movement and start introducing simple, environmentally applicable solutions that are economically sustainable and ecologically rational. Those two have to go together. And I think the sheet mulching with wood chips, if there's a number one microremediation, micro application technology that everybody can participate in today, is basically using wood chips infused with mycelium as filtration membranes to break down biological and chemical toxins. It works, and it works really well. But when you have storms, don't export your wood off your property. Chip it and build a carbon bank in your localized ecosystem. And by doing so, you'll reduce the threat of some of these other toxins and pollutants that we're encountering.
Excellent. Microdosing specifically, dosing in general, and sort of in a framework of where can people go for reliable information? what's available clinically, what's available publicly to guide people in making those decisions for themselves?
Nature provides, I don't. No, well, right now, obviously the dozens of universities are engaged in this. They have recruitments. So first and foremost, consult a qualified medical practitioner that's skilled in this. The California Institute of Integral Studies, CIIS, is a great group. MAPS also is a great group. These are basically training professionals to being professional therapists and be able to help people, help to guide these potent medicines. These are medicines. This is really important to me. I understand the urge of younger people wanting to get high, to party, but these have profound effects. And when you understand how deep these effects are, your respect for their responsible use increases. We have to shepherd this knowledge very, very carefully. So, you know, lots of things have happened in the underground who then have now surfaced from revolutions to whatever, and then they become part of our fabric of our society. This is the emergent technology, but we cannot make the same mistakes that were made in the 60s. It's very, very important. So I would caution everyone, be very, very careful about your source of these substances. What a lot of people don't realize is some of these underground cultivation people that are growing them, they get bacteria growing on their mushrooms. And you know, they're trying to make their weight, as is known. They're trying to grow a pound or dried, and they may be 20 grams short of a pound. So they pick all these rotting mushrooms that are covered with bacteria, and they throw it into their mushrooms, and they feed it, and then they sell it to people where people get it, and they basically get food poisoning. And it's associated also with them getting high. So they have a very, very bad trip. That's a combination of those. So that is a really big problem right now, is the quality of the mushrooms that people are obtaining. We need to have a standardized, you know, and approved high quality production standards that are implemented. And so when the decriminalization of psilocybin occurs, quality control is extremely important. And so this is where the health authorities need to come into practice to make sure that the supply chain is as clean and safe.
Absolutely, and we all are going to have a role in this because we need to collect about 1 million signatures in California to put decriminalization on the ballot. There is a booth in the back. There's also a booth, Paul mentioned MAPS. How many people know that MAPS is right here in Santa Cruz? How many people know about MAPS? That's amazing. It's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. It's a worldwide leading organization in the research of these substances, and we should all be proud that it is right here in Santa Cruz, and they're also in the hallway and would love to talk with you about how you can help.
One other thing I want to just advocate is for those of you who understand the importance of this, when you see others going astray and using these in a way that's endangering other people, the thing about psilocybin mushrooms that I like is the extension of gratitude and kindness. Reach out to those people, you know, softly but firmly advise them that it's important that they have very high quality standards and they use these with ultimate respect for the benefit of the commons, not for making money, but for helping everyone in the community, because by doing so, economically, that community will become stronger, and ultimately, that's the best business practice.
Yeah, that actually goes right to the next question. So right now, we're trying to simply decriminalize, which means not getting arrested, to make it as simple as possible, and that's very, very important. But if we look, for example, as cannabis has gone from completely illegal to retail sales, and we look forward to a world where that is possible with mushrooms and psychedelic mushrooms, what do you see as the best practices, and what do you see as the red flags? And I think it is time to start to think about this now before these decisions are being made.
Well, this is where my conservative side comes out on some levels. I think the possession of psilocybin mushrooms and the cultivation should be decriminalized. I think the distribution of psilocybin mushrooms should be regulated for quality standards for the benefit of having a good product, to be healthy, not to endanger people. So I think governmental health inspections of production facilities is important. I think that's really important. That's not to say you can't have your own little psilocybin signed essence patch in your backyard. I mean, that's really easy to do. But, you know, but
nature provides is what
But on the subject of microdosing, I think it's an enormous opportunity. And so I've come up with a formula for microdosing, stacking it with niacin, vitamin B3. Now, microdose basically is taking an amount of psilocybin mushrooms below the threshold of you being able to notice them. So there's no change in consciousness. If you do a microdose and you feel like you're getting high, it's not a microdose. You know, a microdose is basically on the psilocybe cubensis scale is a 1/10 or 1/20th of a gram. 1 gram is definitely liftoff. 5 grams is the full-blown hero's journey. But 1/10 of 1 gram, 1/20th of 1 gram, most people are not going to feel it. They'll feel in a happier mood. You know, maybe a bike ride, it's a little bit more thrilling. But there's no change in dexterity. You're not getting high. It's not like drinking a half a beer. You know, you feel no effect at all. That's a microdose. You stack that with niacin, vitamin B3, and those of you who've taken niacin in high amounts, you take 100 milligrams of niacin with a 1/20th of a gram of psilocybe cubensis, for instance. In that microdose formula, if you sold that over the counter, again, approved and regulated by the FDA, and someone tried to take 10 times that much, or 20 times that much, in order to get a liftoff dose, they'd be taking 2 grams of vitamin B3. And those of you who've had vitamin B3 at 100 to 200 milligrams, you get hot, you get flushing, you get itchy, your clothes itch. It's a very uncomfortable experience. So at 10 times that amount, it's an extraordinarily uncomfortable experience. This way, it limits the ability of somebody taking an over-the-counter microdose and trying to get high, because it becomes the antabuse. Now, it works for 3 reasons. It excites the peripheral nervous system. You get itching. You get excitation of the endpoints of the nervous system. Well, I believe that drives the neurogenic benefits of psilocybin. We know psilocybin and its analogs create neurogenesis. It's a vasodilator. And also, it has this antabuse effect. I think stacking it with vitamin B3 is a very, very good way of getting this out to the masses. Because many, many people, as I've mentioned in the film that I know, would never consider getting high. But the idea of preventing dementia, Alzheimer's, to be creative and smart as they get older, when they start forgetting things, who wants to become dumber in age, right? You want to become smarter in age, and hopefully the body intellect of society is preserved, because that knowledge is part of our economic capital of our society. When we lose the knowledge of elders through forgetfulness and dementia, the cost of society is extraordinarily high. So I think this benefits. So I think microdosing stacked with niacin is a very good pathway. The problem with microdosing and not having a regulatory, something in it that can prevent macrodosing is that I can see the FDA would freak out, right? And so otherwise it has to be by prescription and therapeutically. The last thing I'll say on this, the advantage of microdosing also is, I call it the universality of use. The advantage of it helps everybody. And there's so many different endpoints from these studies: depression, creativity, PTSD, neurogenesis. In the Alzheimer's studies going on currently at Johns Hopkins with 2 strong doses of psilocybin. These studies are being approved because there's evidence that justifies these studies to be given approval by the FDA. So I think the benefit of these mushrooms and these substances cannot be underestimated, but the entourage effect of the psilocybin analogs many of which are not illegal, they're legal, and they do not get you high. That's, I think, the natural form of psilocybin mushrooms has an entourage effect that we need to look at very carefully compared to pure psilocybin. Why that's so important is pure psilocybin is $1,000 to $5,000 a gram. How is an African-American ostracized, economically challenged individual in the urban setting going to be able to afford to go to Johns Hopkins or go to a therapeutic, treatment program that costs tens of thousands or many, many thousands of dollars? They're not going to be able to do it. You can grow psilocybin mushrooms for the cost of portobellos, and you can reduce the cost from $1,000 a gram to an equivalent of $2 a gram. This then democratizes the use of psilocybin mushrooms that are the greatest public benefit. So I would hope in the next 10 years that microdosing of psilocybin in its natural form, standardized to markers, so there's consistency in the production, will be something that we can help society at all levels of the economic spectrum.
Absolutely. So I think what I'm hearing you say, if I can sum up, is you're not going to want to take these mushrooms all the time, even if you could. Microdosing can be done very cost effectively. So if you're from the outside looking in and you're like, this is the business opportunity of a lifetime, it's not. If you want to help and make mushrooms available and make the world a better place, it's a great opportunity. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. I want to thank you all for coming, for supporting this film, for supporting this movement. The Mushroom Festival in Santa Cruz is still happening again tomorrow. Tell your friends everything that you saw and learned and heard tonight. And Paul, if you have anything to leave the people with, I'm sure we'd love to hear it.
Keep the mycelium running. Thank you.
Take care. Be safe, everyone.